Imagine opening your eyes nearly 200,000 years ago on the African savannah. There are no cities, no roads, no written language, and certainly no idea that billions of humans will one day cover every continent on Earth. Your only concern is finding enough food before sunset while avoiding becoming food yourself. If someone could somehow place a modern mirror in front of you, one detail would stand out immediately. Your skin would almost certainly be dark. That simple fact leads to one of the most fascinating questions in human evolution. If the earliest members of our species had dark skin, why do people today display such an incredible range of skin colors? From the deepest brown to the palest ivory, how did one species produce so many different appearances? The answer isn't found in culture or civilization. It begins with sunlight, survival, and hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection quietly reshaping humanity. Long before the concepts of race or nationality existed, there was only one home for modern humans: Africa. For roughly 90% of Homo sapiens history, every human being lived somewhere on the African continent. It was here that our ancestors hunted, gathered, raised children, and slowly evolved into the species we recognize today. Africa also happens to receive some of the strongest ultraviolet radiation on Earth. Sunlight gives life, but it also carries invisible dangers. Ultraviolet rays can damage DNA, increase the risk of skin injury, and reduce folate, a vitamin essential for healthy pregnancies and normal development. For people living under intense sunlight generation after generation, protecting the body from constant UV exposure became a matter of survival. This is where melanin enters the story. Melanin is the natural pigment responsible for darker skin. More importantly, it acts like a biological shield, absorbing much of the harmful ultraviolet radiation before it reaches vulnerable cells. Think of it as evolution's built-in sunscreen. Individuals with higher levels of melanin were generally better protected in equatorial Africa. They were more likely to stay healthy, reproduce successfully, and pass those protective genes to their children. Natural selection didn't choose dark skin because it looked better. Evolution never cares about beauty. It only asks one question: did this trait improve the chances of surviving long enough to leave descendants? For hundreds of thousands of years, the answer in Africa was yes. Dark skin became one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. Then something extraordinary happened. Humans began walking beyond Africa. Between roughly 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, small groups started leaving their ancestral homeland. Some crossed into the Middle East, others gradually spread through Europe, many continued east across Asia. Eventually, humans reached Australia, Siberia, and even crossed into the Americas during the Ice Age. No maps guided them, no borders existed, no one knew what lay beyond the next mountain. Generation after generation simply kept moving. As people settled farther from the equator, they encountered environments unlike anything their ancestors had experienced. The biggest change wasn't the temperature, it was the sunlight. The farther north or south you travel, the weaker ultraviolet radiation becomes. At first, this sounds like good news. Less UV exposure means less damage. Problem solved. Except the same sunlight that can harm the body also performs another essential task. It allows the skin to produce vitamin D. Vitamin D helps build strong bones, supports the immune system, and plays a critical role in healthy growth. Without enough of it, the body struggles in ways that can reduce long-term survival and reproductive success. Suddenly, the very feature that had protected humans so effectively in Africa created a new challenge. Dark skin blocked precious ultraviolet rays that were now relatively scarce. In regions with weak sunlight, absorbing every available ray became increasingly important. Over countless generations, people with slightly lighter skin often produced vitamin D more efficiently under cloudy skies and shorter winters. Little by little, natural selection favored those genetic changes, not in decades, not in centuries, but across thousands upon thousands of years. This gradual shift eventually transformed many populations living in northern regions. One of the biggest surprises revealed by ancient DNA is that Europe did not become light-skinned overnight. In fact, the earliest modern humans who entered Europe were probably much darker than many people imagine today. For thousands of years, European hunter-gatherers likely looked very different from present-day Europeans. Some ancient individuals even appear to have combined dark skin with striking blue eyes, a combination that seems unusual today, but was entirely possible through separate genetic changes. Only later did lighter skin become widespread. As agriculture spread across Europe, diets changed dramatically. Farming communities consumed fewer vitamin D-rich foods than many hunter-gatherers, making sunlight even more important. At the same time, different populations mixed together, and mutations affecting skin pigmentation became increasingly common. Eventually, pale skin spread across much of Europe, not because it was superior, not because it represented progress, simply because it fit the environmental conditions better. Evolution has no long-term plan. It constantly adjusts to local circumstances. Give it enough time and populations slowly adapt to whatever challenges surround them. Europe, however, is only part of the story. Asia reached a remarkably similar destination through a different genetic route. Imagine two engineers solving the same problem using completely different designs. The final machines perform the same job, but their internal mechanisms are not identical. Human evolution often works the same way. East Asian populations also developed lighter skin compared with their African ancestors, yet many of the genes responsible differ from those common in Europeans. The environmental pressure was similar. The biological solution was different. Scientists call this convergent evolution, where separate populations independently evolve comparable traits because they face similar challenges. Nature is surprisingly inventive. There is rarely only one path towards survival. That creativity becomes even more obvious when looking across the entire planet. Many people casually divide humanity into a handful of racial categories. Reality is far more complicated. Skin color exists on a continuous spectrum shaped by geography, migration, climate, diet, and thousands of years of mixing between neighboring populations. North Africans developed different pigmentation patterns than people living farther south. Middle Eastern populations followed their own evolutionary history. South Asians display enormous diversity, influenced by countless migrations over millennia. East Asians evolved their own collection of pigmentation genes. Indigenous Australians retained adaptations suited to intense sunlight after tens of thousands of years of isolation. Native American populations carried genetic traits inherited from ancient groups that crossed from Asia into the Americas during the Ice Age. Instead of neat categories, humanity resembles a giant gradient with countless subtle transitions. Evolution almost never produces sharp boundaries. It creates gradual change. Neighbors tend to resemble neighbors. Differences accumulate slowly across distance until populations separated by entire continents begin to look noticeably different. Yet beneath those visible differences lies an even more remarkable truth. Every human alive today ultimately traces their ancestry back to African populations. Whether someone has blonde hair in Scandinavia, dark skin in Nigeria, black hair in Korea, or indigenous ancestry in South America, every family tree stretches backward toward the same ancient roots. Keep traveling into the past, and separate branches slowly merge together. Eventually, they become one shared trunk. This means that many of the differences people emphasize today are actually incredibly recent. In evolutionary terms, humanity spent far longer looking relatively similar than looking different. Our species existed for hundreds of thousands of years before many of today's familiar appearances became common. Genetically, humans remain astonishingly alike. Despite our visible diversity, any two people on Earth share the overwhelming majority of their DNA. The traits that separate populations involve only a tiny fraction of our genome. Our similarities vastly outweigh our differences. Now picture that ordinary human standing somewhere in East Africa nearly 200,000 years ago. They knew nothing about Europe, nothing about China, nothing about the Americas. They could not imagine skyscrapers, satellites, airplanes, smartphones, or social media debates over race and identity. Their daily life revolved around finding water, gathering food, protecting family, and surviving another day. Yet hidden within their descendants was every future civilization, every language, every culture, every nation, every face, every skin tone. The extraordinary story of human pigmentation is not really about difference, it is about adaptation. Slightly stronger sunlight here, slightly weaker sunlight there. Generation after generation, genes shifted almost invisibly as natural selection responded to local conditions. No dramatic transformation happened in a single lifetime. Instead, tiny genetic changes accumulated so slowly that no individual would have noticed them. Only after thousands of generations did those small adjustments become obvious. That is how evolution usually works. Quietly, patiently, without any destination in mind. So what color were the first modern humans? Nearly all available evidence suggests they had dark skin, an adaptation perfectly suited for life beneath the powerful African sun. Every lighter shade that appeared later was simply another chapter in the same evolutionary journey. No skin color is the original, best version. No pigmentation is more advanced than another. Each reflects the environment in which countless ancestors struggled, survived, and raised children. The next time you look at your own reflection, remember that your skin tells an ancient story stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. It records migrations across deserts, forests, mountains, and frozen plains. It carries the legacy of changing climates, shifting diets, and relentless natural selection. Most importantly, it reminds you that every person alive today belongs to the same remarkable family. One species, one shared ancestry, one beginning beneath the African sun. Everything that followed, the countless shades of humanity, the cultures, the civilizations, and the identities we recognize today, grew from that single origin. Our differences may seem obvious in everyday life, but in evolutionary time, they are recent brushstrokes on an ancient canvas. Beneath every shade of skin beats the same human story, written long before history began, and still unfolding with every new generation.